Well, in preparing and thinking about this morning, our starting video, I can't watch it. I looked through several, and every single one I just don't get over, and I choke up, and I think there must be something something wrong with me. I'm emotionally unstable or something. I just can't. But what I'm realizing is that I look at those young people now differently than I did when I was a kid. And I see them now on the far side of raising my own children, and I see my children raising their children. And now I see just how very, very precious these young people are. And I want to emphasize, it is not just American young people. Mothers, fathers all over the world throughout time have sacrificed greatly when their sons have gone off and their daughters have gone off. And so it carries a poignancy that perhaps only comes with experience and time, and unless we've nurtured a sensitivity about such matters. But I'm going to share with you from the book of Exodus. This is the first time after the Exodus, when God's children were called out of Egypt, that they actually had to fight a war. So you realize that they are just people. It's a ragtag gathering of people who are drawn out into the wilderness, and frankly, they're a bunch of complainers. They're out there, it's hot, the food is bad, they're eating quail and manna, which they think is actually locust dung that's left over from the night before. And they're complaining, and now they're running out of water. So they're griping to Moses, and Moses brought them out into the wilderness, and can't they go back to Egypt? At least they could go back and eat, even though they were living under slavery. It was better somehow to be a slave and to get free meals every day than to be free. But that was not Moses' way, nor was it God's way. So God told Moses, okay, use that staff that I gave you and strike a rock, and water will come gushing out, and the people will be able to drink. Soon thereafter, after they've had their fill and they're starting to be complacent again because they've got water in their bellies, they're attacked by a tribe called the Amalekites. Hear the word of God as it comes to us from the book of Exodus. When the people of Israel were still at Rephidim, the warriors of Amalek attacked them. Moses commanded Joshua, choose some men to go out and fight the army of Amalek for us. Tomorrow I will stand at the top of the hill holding the staff of God in my hand. So Joshua did what Moses had commanded and fought the army of Amalek. Meanwhile, Moses, Aaron, and Hur climbed to the top of a nearby hill. As long as Moses held up the staff in his hands, the Israelites had the advantage. But whenever he dropped his hands, the Amalekites gained the advantage. Moses' arms soon became so tired he could no longer hold them up. So Aaron and Hur found a stone for him to sit on. Then they stood on each side of Moses, holding up his hands, so his hands held steady until sunset. As a result, Joshua overwhelmed the army of Amalek in battle. After the victory, the Lord instructed Moses, write this down on a scroll as a permanent reminder and read it aloud to Joshua. I will erase the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Moses built an altar there and named it Yahweh Nissi, which means the Lord is my banner. He said, they have raised their fist against the Lord's throne, so now the Lord will be at war with Amalek generation after generation. And may God add his understanding to this hearing of his word. So in the summer, 1970, I had been to Koinonia Farm, where Habitat for Humanity was just getting started. And after I was done, I was with a Young Life camp. After I was done, a friend and I hitchhiked up to New York City. And we housed with the Young Life director who was living in Brooklyn. And he took me over to Manhattan so I could play some basketball. So I was on the Lower East Side of Manhattan playing basketball with the guys in New York City, the players in New York City. They were legendary. And so I was out there going at it with these guys. At the same time, at the pole of one of the baskets, we had a radio blasting. And during that, they stopped and started to go through the dates of the lottery for the Vietnam War. Because it was at that time they started drafting according to a lottery. And so I stopped and I listened as my birth date drew near. So I listened, October 12, 13, 14, got up to October 23rd, and I went like this to get the guys to shut up for a moment. October 24th, I was number 312. High enough that I didn't have to worry about being drafted or having to serve. So I kept on playing. Forgot about it. Just kept playing. And that's kind of what I did. I kept on playing, kept on living, went to college, went to seminary, just did what I did. I just kept on playing. While those who drew numbers under 100 that year, and I'm not sure just how high, I think it went up to 160 something that year, they had to serve. They left their homes. They kissed their parents. They got on buses or trains or planes and ships and went over. And when they got there, the air was thick with humidity. It was hot. There were bugs everywhere. There was rock music blasting, and their lives were forever changed. And some of them, their lives were forever gone. Some left body parts behind. Others left their sanity. Others left their sobriety behind. And those who served in that war returned to a hotbed political environment, and some of them, as they returned after giving so much, were ridiculed, yelled at, spat upon. Not then did they say, "We are so happy for your service." Not then, when the nation was so horrifically polarized. As for me, for so many others, well, I just kept on playing. College and then in seminary, I played club basketball and club volleyball. I just kept on playing. And at some point, we have to wake up. And we have to remember that so many have given so much so that we can play on. One man whom I deeply admire and greatly respect, Bernie Turner. You may know him. He lives in town, he and his wife. He is now in his 90s. He and his wife Rita started down here at the Cove Inn on what is now the largest online university in the world, Walden University. They started that, and yet Bernie I met while I was working out at the Naples Fitness Center. He and I would just enter into conversations. He was intrigued that I was a pastor because he was an atheist. And Bernie introduced me to the dear community of people that I've come to love and hold in great regard, and those are the atheists here in town. Many have become good friends. But one day Bernie told me the story. Bernie had been in Belgium during the Battle of the Bulge when American troops were virtually surrounded by the Nazis and were about to be wiped out. He was there, along with my father, along with Dana's not here this morning, but Dana Schersted's father, along with many of your father's relatives, etc. In that frightening time, that cold winter. But they broke out from there, and Bernie, part of the Fourth Army, made his way across and was in Czechoslovakia. And he was in a column of soldiers, and he was riding in a jeep behind a half-track with a bunch of young soldiers piled on the top. And at a time like that, everyone's just talking, goofing around, and not thinking much of anything. And then suddenly that half-track hit a rock and tumbled over the side of the mountain, and everyone was killed. And Bernie told me he had grown up in a Jewish family in New York City and how he loved Saturdays because after the synagogue service, everyone would get together and argue. And he loved it, this intellectual wrestling that was taking place. But he said on that day, he exchanged his mezuzah for a rabbit's foot. And he said, why would God? The only sense I can make in this world is that it is all just random. So Bernie lost his faith. His faith died. He came back without any faith left. So these who've served, who've lost so much, we remember. And the story of Moses, the story in which Moses himself, who was 80 years old, the Amalekites attack. His people are a bunch of what about me kind of people, what about my needs kind of people. They're griping, complaining. The food's bad, the water's bad. Why did you bring us here? And then they're attacked. They're weak. They are divided. They're all over the landscape. So for the first time, they encounter some of the really hard stuff of life, and that is that they're attacked. And the Amalekites are understood as they're a metaphor for evil. But the people themselves, they're not perfect either. But we have them attacking with the intent of wiping Israel off the face of the map. And that kind of attack has gone on generation after generation after generation to wipe Israel out, to remove them from the face of the earth. So Moses told Joshua, go find some of those that you can trust. And I'm too old. I'm 80. I'd like to fight, but I'll get in the way. So I'm going to go up to the top of the hill. I'm going to take the staff. You know the staff, Joshua. The staff, the same one that I used to convince Pharaoh, the one I threw on the ground and it turned into a serpent that ate the other serpents of Pharaoh's. The same staff that I struck the Red Sea with, and the waters danced up one side and then the other, and we walked across on dry land, and then it came down on the Egyptian army. The same staff that I used just the other day when water came gushing from the rock. That staff I'm taking up to the mountaintop with me. And the Lord instructed him, take the staff and hold it up. And as long as it is hoisted up, the people of God will prevail. But if you fail, Moses, Amalek and his armies will prevail. And so Moses goes. He's 80. His arms get tired. But he's holding it. And toward the end of the day, having held it up all day and his arms are shaking, Aaron and Hur, who were with him, brought a rock for him to sit on, and he sat down holding up that staff. And he, as it weakened, he would see the Amalekites prevail, and so he held it back up again, and then Aaron and Hur stood alongside him, and they held up the staff along with him. And the Israelites prevailed. That staff is remembered by our Lord when he said, my rod and thy staff will comfort thee. Well, that's the 23rd Psalm, pardon me. A rod and thy staff will comfort thee. Prepare us a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. The staff of God. And the soldiers on the ground saw it. And it was to them an encouragement. As long as Moses is there, they're encouraged. As long as that is going on, they know they're not alone. Their great leader is with them. Their father, their grandfather is with them. It's a reminder to all of us. We do participate. We enter in. We provide encouragement, support. Our nation's been at war now for 17 straight years or longer. Who can keep track? And how important it is when we see people who are serving and just say, thank you for your service and do what we can. And our church is now going to support the efforts of Honor Flight, so that some of our veterans from from Korea, as well as from the Second World War, can go to Washington, D.C., and really know that all kinds of people have been holding up that staff, supporting and encouraging, and letting them know that their efforts mattered and matter to this day. And in that way, we are with all who are engaged in the battle for freedom. And yet at the same time, Moses, the staff, I'm just holding it up, somehow this is going to make a difference. How does this do anything? How am I doing anything at all? What do my prayers actually do? When I know that young men, young women are falling, and yet my prayers, do they do anything at all? You know, we live in the reality that we don't have nice, easy cause and effect with prayer. We would like to say Moses on the hill could identify that young man down there and say, Lord, preserve that kid. And to see that child preserved, but we all know that child may fall just as other children fell. We would like to have cause and effect, but we just don't. But somehow we know that God is there, God is protecting, God is watching out. Somehow His will is being enacted. I was so privileged to have the relationship that I did with with our dear brother Peter Thomas. And 2 years ago, almost 4 years ago, here in the sanctuary on the 70th anniversary of D-Day, Peter gave us his poem, and a powerful, moving presentation it was, with John Williams' Hymn to the Fallen in the background, as well as photographs from that event, as well as then photographs of our own people or parents of our people who served in the Second World War. But when he was done, and everyone stood and was applauding, when he was done, he was walking out, and he was right about at that cross aisle, and a guy came out, close to his age, and gave him a big hug. He said, "Peter, who landed on Normandy Beach the day after D-Day, and his experience was to see the carnage on the beach. He came out, gave him a hug, and said, 'Peter, we needed you there that day.'" He was on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944. And at the time, he was 16 years old. He lied to get in. Don't you love that kind of liar? Because he was so intent upon doing what he could to further the cause of freedom. And somehow, some way, in the providence of God, that young life was preserved through the war. Peter himself tells a story about how he got his purple heart, which to him felt like a silly reward, a silly thing to be receiving. And I said, "Well, Peter, why? You got injured." He said, "Well, let me tell you what happened." He says, we were in a building, in a village in Western Germany, and there was all kinds of fighting going on, and I went up second story of a wrecked up building, and I was simply going to try to get a position in there, and I had something itching under my sock. So I reached down to scratch an itch. And when I did, a shell went right over my head and hit the wall behind me. And I got the Purple Cross because all of those bricks flew off and banged me up. He was laughing as he's telling me this. But he also said, "Somehow I know that was the Lord." And he could not come from that conflict without living every day for God. And so he did. A great elder from my church in Texas, Winifred Vignes, told the story about how she was flying from Fort Worth to Lubbock, and this was during the Second World War, and she got bumped off because a bunch of soldiers were going to get on that plane and fly to Lubbock. And she was so angry, sitting in that hot airport in Fort Worth, and had to wait for several hours for the next plane until she heard that that flight had gone down. And all those young men were lost. And she said, from that day on, I lived for God. There was not a moment, not a day, that I wasn't alert to the gift of life that God had given me. Somehow, the holding up of that staff, somehow the gift that God has given us to pray, to uphold one another and to encourage one another, somehow it all enters in, whether we're 80 or 18 years old. And one final story. So Peter, Thomas, and a few other young soldiers who were near Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, horribly cold weather, and there wasn't a man there who believed that they were going to be home alive. In fact, their leaders, their colonels and their generals told them, write your letters home, because we will probably not get out of this. So they were holed up in a barn, and when they arrived up there, they looked out, and there was a Panzer tank with a muzzle pointed right at them. And one of the young men who were with Peter just said to him, he said, your dad was a minister. Some Christmas this is. You think Santa Claus will find us up here? What good does this do us? Well, your dad was a minister, Peter. Have you got anything for us? Peter's father made all those children memorize both Scripture and Shakespeare, and then recite it at Sunday dinner after church every single week. The kids hated it because they had to recite that stuff. It meant nothing to them. What do they care about these and thous of Shakespeare in the Bible? But recite it they did, Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. Can we go out and play now? One more, your brother has to go yet. Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. But then there they were. And when Peter was asked, have you got anything for us? Christmas Eve. And Peter, from memory, began to recite. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And each went to his own city. Joseph and Mary also went up from Galilee to the city of David. The entire Christmas story from the 2nd chapter of Luke. Somehow, we all enter in. Somehow, we play a role. And again, there were German parents praying for their children. There were Japanese parents praying for their children. There were people all over the world whose sons and daughters have been put out in the place of hardship and danger. And when we are engaged in that which we understand to be the final, ultimate freedom that has been purchased for us by the sacrifice of Christ, then our prayers have their intended effect. Beyond our view, but the Lord is glorified. Will you bow with me in prayer? Lord, we praise you, we thank you that our prayers do not go unheard, nor do they go unheeded. We thank you, O Lord, that it is your will that in the fullness of time, that at your name, every knee would bow and every tongue would confess. So, Lord, it is your intent that we all might know the depths of freedom. For it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. We thank you and praise you in his name. Amen.